5 Apache girls hanged upside down to dying, until the ranchers showed up. The first light of dawn crept slowly over the wide, quiet land. The sky was soft pink at the edges and pale blue in the middle, like a calm blanket stretched above the earth. The air was cool, fresh, and clean, carrying the smell of dry grass, warm dust, and distant pine trees. Birds began to sing one by one, as if they were waking the world with gentle music. A light breeze moved across the open plains, making the tall grass sway like waves on a quiet sea. At the edge of a low valley, an Apache camp slowly came to life. Small fires still glowed from the night before, their red embers shining softly in the early morning. Thin lines of smoke rose straight into the sky, curling and fading as the air grew warmer. Tents made of animal hides stood in a loose circle, their entrances facing the rising sun. Outside some tents, people slept wrapped in blankets, breathing slowly, still deep in dreams. In one part of the camp, 5 young Apache girls were already awake. They were close friends and cousins, growing up together like sisters. Their names were softly spoken among their families, but to everyone in the camp, they were known as the lively group that always stayed together. They laughed together, worked together, and helped one another whenever they could. The oldest of the 5 was called Nala. She was not tall, but she carried herself with quiet confidence. Her dark hair was braided neatly, and her eyes were sharp and thoughtful. She often helped her mother and the older women, learning how to gather plants, prepare food, and care for younger children. Though still young, she acted with a calm maturity that made others trust her. Beside her stood Lina, a gentle and kind-hearted girl with a warm smile. She loved listening to stories from elders and often sat quietly near the fire at night, watching the flames dance. Lina was known for her patience and her soft, careful way of speaking. Animals seemed comfortable around her, and even nervous horses stayed calm when she approached them slowly. The third girl, Maya, was full of energy. She moved quickly, spoke brightly, and laughed often. She loved running across the open ground, feeling the wind rush past her. Maya was curious about everything. She asked questions constantly, sometimes making the elders smile and shake their heads at her endless wonder. Next to Maya stood Kira, smaller and quieter than the others. She was shy but very observant. She noticed small details that others missed, like the shape of a bird's wing or the pattern of clouds in the sky. Though she did not speak much, when she did, her words were thoughtful and wise beyond her years. The youngest of the group was little Sari. She still held on to her older cousin's hand at times, especially when walking through tall grass or rocky paths. Her eyes were bright and full of innocence. She loved to sing softly while walking, making up simple tunes that floated through the morning air. That day, the 5 girls had a simple but important task. They were to walk to a nearby creek to gather fresh water and look for ripe berries along the banks. This was a normal part of their daily life, something they had done many times before. The elders trusted them, knowing they were careful and always stayed together. As the sun slowly climbed higher, the camp became more active. Women stepped out of their tents, stretching and rubbing sleep from their eyes. Some began preparing breakfast over small fires, placing flat bread on hot stones or stirring simple soups in clay pots. Men checked their horses, adjusting saddles and tightening ropes, while children ran playfully between tents. Before leaving, the girls stopped near Nala's grandmother, who sat by a small fire wrapped in a warm shawl. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes were bright and full of kindness. She watched the girls with a gentle smile. "Walk together," she said softly. "Listen to the land. It speaks if you are quiet enough." Nala nodded respectfully, placing her hand over her heart. The other girls did the same, following her lead. They knew these words were not just advice, but a lesson passed down through many generations. With woven baskets on their backs and leather water bags in their hands, the girls began their walk. The ground beneath their feet was cool and slightly damp from the night dew. Their footsteps were light, barely making a sound as they moved across the open land. They followed a narrow path that wound between tall grasses and scattered rocks. Small wild flowers dotted the ground in shades of yellow, purple, and white. Butterflies fluttered above them, their delicate wings shining in the early sunlight. In the distance, hills rose gently like sleeping giants, covered in patches of green shrubs and trees. As they walked, the girls talked quietly among themselves. Maya pointed out a hawk circling high in the sky, while Lena admired a blooming cactus near the path. Kira stopped briefly to watch a small lizard dart across a warm rock, and Sari giggled at the way it disappeared in a flash. The creek was not far, but the journey felt pleasant, not rushed. The girls enjoyed the peaceful morning, feeling connected to the land around them. To them, this was not just a task, but a moment of freedom, a chance to be together away from the busy camp. When they reached the water, the scene was beautiful. The creek flowed gently over smooth stones, its clear water sparkling in the sunlight. Tall reeds lined the banks, swaying softly in the breeze. Birds perched on nearby branches, dipping their beaks into the stream before flying off again. The girls filled their water bags carefully, making sure not to spill a drop. They knelt at the edge of the creek, cupping water in their hands and drinking slowly, feeling its cool freshness slide down their throats. After filling their bags, they moved along the bank to search for berries. Small bushes heavy with ripe fruit grew nearby, their deep red color standing out against the green leaves. The girls picked them gently, placing only the best ones into their baskets. They laughed and shared stories as they worked, sometimes stopping to taste a berry and grin at its sweet flavor. Even Sari joined in, carefully picking small handfuls and proudly showing them to Nala. For a time, everything felt perfect. The land was calm, the sky was clear, and the girls were happy in each other's company. They did not sense any danger, only the simple joy of being young and free in the wide open world. Back at the camp, the morning passed normally. People worked, cooked, and talked. But as the sun climbed higher, some began to notice that the girls had been gone longer than expected. The elders did not worry at first. After all, the girls sometimes took their time, enjoying the walk and the quiet. Still, a feeling of slight unease started to settle over a few of them, like a small shadow that would not quite disappear. Nala's grandmother sat by the fire, staring toward the distant hills where the girls had gone. She did not speak, but her expression grew more serious. As the hours passed, the sun reached its peak, casting bright light over the camp. The girls still had not returned. Some of the younger children began asking where they were, and their mothers gently told them to be patient. A few elders exchanged quiet glances. They knew the land well, and they knew that even familiar places could sometimes hold unexpected risks. Without raising alarm, they decided it was wise to keep an eye on the path leading from the creek. Two experienced trackers, both respected men in the community, prepared to follow the girls' trail if needed. They moved calmly, not in fear, but with careful concern. They checked their supplies, adjusted their leather boots, and studied the direction the girls had taken earlier that morning. Meanwhile, the camp remained outwardly peaceful. Smoke still rose from cooking fires, horses grazed nearby, and children played in the dust, but beneath the surface a quiet tension began to grow. The elders gathered near the center of the camp and spoke in low voices. They trusted the girls, but they also understood that the world beyond their home was unpredictable. Still, they held on to hope, believing that the five friends would soon appear on the horizon, laughing and waving as they always did. Far away, the land stretched endlessly under the bright sun. The wind carried the distant sounds of nature, birds calling, leaves rustling, and water flowing. But it carried no sign of the five girls yet. And so, as the day moved forward, the Apache camp waited, watched, and hoped, unaware that this quiet morning would soon become the beginning of a much bigger and unexpected journey. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the warmth of the day spread across the wide land. The air shimmered slightly above the ground, making the distant hills look soft and blurry. The five girls were still near the creek, slowly finishing their gathering, unaware that the calm around them was about to change. A gentle breeze moved through the tall reeds along the water. The leaves brushed against one another with a quiet, whispering sound. For a moment, everything seemed peaceful, just like any other day. Lena was carefully tying her water bag shut, while Maya leaned over a bush to pick a final handful of berries. Kira stood nearby, looking out across the open plain, her eyes scanning the horizon out of habit. Suddenly, she noticed something that made her pause. Far in the distance, small figures were moving along a dusty trail. At first, they were too far away to see clearly, but their shapes were unfamiliar. Kira's heart gave a small, uneasy beat, though she did not yet feel real fear. She stepped closer to Nala and spoke quietly. "Look there!" she said, pointing toward the distant trail. Nala straightened and followed her gaze. She shaded her eyes with her hand and studied the figures carefully. The group appeared to be moving slowly but steadily, crossing the open land. They were not from the Apache camp, that much was clear. Maya, noticing their seriousness, stopped laughing and joined them. Even little Sari grew quiet, sensing that something felt different. Nala took a deep breath. She had been taught to stay calm in uncertain situations. "We should finish quickly and head back," she said gently. "We have enough now." The girls nodded and began gathering their things. They moved a little faster than before, tying bags, closing baskets, and making sure nothing was left behind. Their light-hearted mood had shifted into cautious alertness. As they started back along the path toward home, the distant figures drew closer. The girls could now see that it was a small group of strangers traveling through the area. They were not openly threatening, but their presence felt out of place, like a storm cloud drifting toward a clear sky. Nala led the way, walking with steady steps. Lena stayed close beside her, while Maya kept glancing over her shoulder. Kira watched the land carefully, noticing every detail, and Sari held tightly onto Nala's hand. The strangers eventually noticed the girls as well. They slowed their pace and turned slightly in their direction. There was no shouting, no anger, only a silent, watchful curiosity that made the girls uneasy. Nala decided they should not run. Running could draw more attention. Instead, she kept walking, hoping the strangers would continue on their own path without interference. But as the girls moved farther from the creek and closer to a rocky stretch of land, the strangers began to change their direction. They slowly started moving toward the girls' path, closing the distance between them. Maya's heart began to race. She could feel the tension in the air like a tight string pulled too far. Lena squeezed her water bag nervously, while Kira quietly looked for any possible safe route back to camp. Before the girls could react further, the strangers reached them. They stopped a few steps away, standing in a loose line. Their faces were serious, their movements controlled. They spoke in a language the girls did not understand, their voices low and steady. Nala stepped forward slightly, trying to appear calm and respectful. She raised her hands slowly, showing that the girls meant no harm. Lena followed her lead, and the others stayed close together. One of the strangers stepped closer and gestured toward the rocky outcrop nearby. His expression was firm but not cruel. It was clear, even without words, that he wanted the girls to follow. Nala felt her stomach tighten, but she knew arguing or resisting could make things worse. She glanced back at her friends, seeing fear in their eyes but also trust in her. Taking a steady breath, she nodded slowly. The strangers led them away from the main path toward the rocky area. The ground became rougher beneath their feet, covered in small stones that shifted and rolled as they walked. The wind felt stronger here, sweeping across the open space with a dry whistling sound. The rocky outcrop rose like a small hill in the distance, its surface uneven and cracked by time. There were deep shadows between the stones, making the place feel more isolated than the open plains. When they reached the area, the strangers guided the girls to a flat, sheltered spot between two large rocks. It was out of sight from the main trail, but not hidden deep in a cave or enclosed space. The sky was still open above them and sunlight spilled down between the rocks. The girls were told, through gestures, to sit and stay together. The strangers kept a watchful distance, standing nearby but not crowding them. There was no shouting, no rough handling, only a tense stillness that made the girls feel trapped and uncertain. Nala sat with her back straight, trying to remain strong. Lena placed her hand gently over Sari's, soothing her as best she could. Maya stared at the ground, fighting back tears, while Kira quietly observed every movement around them, searching for any chance to leave. Time seemed to stretch slowly, each minute feeling much longer than the last. The sun moved across the sky, casting shifting shadows over the rocky ground. The girls whispered to one another in low voices, offering comfort and staying close. Far away, back at the Apache camp, the unease had grown stronger. The elders now knew something was wrong. The two trackers prepared to follow the girls' trail, their faces calm but serious. They moved quickly yet carefully, reading the land like an open book. They noticed the girls' footprints along the path, still clear in the soft dust. The trackers followed them toward the creek, scanning for any unusual signs. As they reached the water, they saw where the girls had filled their bags and picked berries. Everything looked normal at first, but then near the edge of the creek, they spotted different tracks, deeper, unfamiliar footprints that did not belong to anyone from their camp. The trackers exchanged a quiet glance. They knew these tracks meant outsiders had been here. Without speaking much, they continued forward, following both sets of prints as they led away from the water. Meanwhile, somewhere farther across the land, a lone rancher was riding his horse along a dusty trail. He was a weathered man, used to long days under the open sky. His hat sat low over his eyes, and his boots were covered in dry dust from miles of travel. He had left his ranch early that morning to check his fences and look for any lost cattle. His horse moved at a steady pace, its hooves making soft thuds against the ground. As he rode, the rancher noticed something unusual. Near a rocky stretch of land, he saw fresh tracks that did not match the usual patterns of animals he knew. They were mixed, some small, some larger, and they seemed to lead toward the rocky outcrop in the distance. Curiosity tugged at him. He slowed his horse and studied the ground more closely. The tracks looked recent, made not long ago. There were no signs of struggle, but something about the scene felt off. The rancher adjusted his hat and guided his horse off the main trail, following the tracks toward the rocks. He did not feel fear, but he did feel a growing sense of concern. He had lived on this land long enough to trust his instincts. Back at the rocky outcrop, the girls remained seated together. The strangers still stood nearby, their presence heavy in the quiet air. The girls could hear their own breathing, the distant call of birds, and the soft whistle of the wind through the rocks. Nala kept watching the horizon, hoping to see a familiar figure or smoke from their camp. She refused to let despair take over. She reminded herself of her grandmother's words, to listen to the land and stay steady. Lena whispered softly to Sari, telling her stories to keep her calm. Maya squeezed Kira's hand, and Kira gave a small nod, letting her know she was not alone. The sun continued its slow journey across the sky, and the land held its breath. In the distance, the rancher drew closer to the rocky outcrop. His horse's ears flicked forward, sensing something ahead. The rancher tightened his grip on the reins and leaned slightly forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the scene before him. He could now see figures near the rocks, more than he expected. His concern deepened. He slowed his horse even more, careful not to make sudden movements that might alarm anyone. At the same time, the Apache trackers were also moving steadily across the land, following the trail with skill and determination. Their hearts were steady, but their minds were focused on one thing: finding the 5 girls and bringing them safely home. And so, under the bright, unblinking sun, 3 paths, the girls, the trackers, and the ranchers, were slowly moving toward the same rocky place, each carrying its own tension, hope, and uncertainty. The sun hung high in the sky now, bright and heavy, pouring heat across the wide land. The air felt warm and still, like it was holding its breath. Even the birds flew lower, seeking shade, and the distant hills shimmered in the afternoon light. At the rocky outcrop, the 5 girls remained together, sitting close on the flat ground between the large stones. Their baskets rested beside them, half full of berries, and their water bags lay carefully placed near their feet. Dust clung to the edges of their clothes, and their faces showed signs of worry, though they tried to stay calm. Nala sat upright, her back straight, her eyes constantly moving between her friends and the strangers nearby. She did not speak much, but her presence kept the group steady. She knew that if she panicked, the others would feel it even more. Lena sat beside Sari, gently brushing her hair back from her face. She whispered soft, comforting words, telling her about the creek, the cool water, and the way the sunlight sparkled like tiny stars on its surface. Sari listened quietly, clutching her cousin's sleeve, her fear slowly easing with every gentle word. Maya stared at the ground, tracing small circles in the dust with her finger. Every now and then she glanced up at the strangers, then quickly looked away. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, to understand why they were there, but she held her tongue, remembering what Nala had taught her about patience. Kira, as always, watched everything. She noticed how the shadows moved across the rocks, how the wind shifted through the cracks, how the stranger stood in loose positions instead of tight formation. Her mind worked quietly, taking in every detail, storing it like a map. The strangers themselves were still. They did not speak loudly, did not laugh, did not move in sudden ways. They stood near the edge of the rocky space, looking out across the land more than at the girls. Their expressions were serious, but not filled with anger. Still, their presence created a heavy feeling in the air, like a storm waiting to break. Far across the open plains, the rancher rode steadily toward the rocky outcrop. His horse moved with long, measured steps, its tail flicking gently in the heat. The rancher's boots rested in the stirrups, and his hands held the reins loosely but firmly. As he drew closer, he began to see more clearly. At first, he only noticed shapes, dark figures against the pale rock. Then, as he guided his horse along a slightly higher stretch of ground, the scene came into sharper view. He slowed his horse even more. He could now see that there were several adults standing near the rocks, and in front of them a small group of children sitting close together. His brow furrowed beneath his hat.
This was not what he expected to find in such a remote place.
He sat tall in the saddle, letting his eyes move carefully over the scene. He noticed the baskets of berries, the water bags, the way the girls sat close together rather than scattered. Nothing looked chaotic, but nothing felt right either. The rancher felt a tightening in his chest. Not fear, but concern. He had lived on this land for many years. He knew how rare it was to see young children sitting alone with strangers far from any camp or home. He guided his horse a little closer, stopping at a respectful distance. The horse snorted softly, its ears flicking forward and back, sensing the tension in the air. One of the strangers turned and noticed him. For a moment, there was silence. The stranger did not move toward him, but his posture shifted, more alert now. Another stranger glanced over, then another. Their attention slowly moved from the girls to the lone rider. Nala noticed this change immediately. She followed their gazes and saw the rancher sitting on his horse, outlined against the bright sky. Her heart gave a small, hopeful beat.
A new presence meant new possibility. Lena lifted her head, her eyes widening slightly when she saw him.
Maya straightened, her earlier restlessness replaced by sharp attention. Kira studied the rancher carefully, noting his calm posture, his steady seat in the saddle, and the way his horse stood quietly.
Even little Sari peeked out from behind Lena, her small face curious now instead of frightened. The rancher tipped his hat slightly in a simple greeting, a sign of respect rather than dominance. He did not shout, did not demand answers. He simply sat there, letting the moment breathe. One of the strangers spoke in a low voice to the others, words the girls could not understand. They did not approach the rancher, but they did not move away either. The space between them felt tense but controlled. The rancher's eyes shifted back to the girls. He studied their faces carefully, looking for signs of harm or distress. What he saw concerned him, not because they looked injured, but because they looked uncertain, waiting, and far from home.
He gently urged his horse a few steps closer, stopping again when he reached a place where everyone could see him clearly. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and even.
"I don't want trouble," he said simply.
His tone was not threatening. It carried a steady warmth, the kind of voice that had spoken to cattle, horses, and neighbors in difficult situations for years. The strangers watched him closely. They still did not reply, but their rigid stance softened just a little. The tension in the air shifted from sharp to cautious. Nala gathered her courage. She rose slowly to her feet, keeping her movements gentle and controlled. The others watched her, trusting her lead. She did not step forward far, but just enough to make it clear that she was speaking for the group. Her dark eyes met the rancher's, steady and brave. Though they did not share a language, something passed between them, a silent understanding that both of them cared about the girl's safety. The rancher nodded slowly, acknowledging her. Behind him, far across the plains, 2 Apache trackers were moving with purpose. They had followed the girl's trail from the creek and now crossed the open ground toward the rocky outcrop. Their movements were quiet but fast, their eyes constantly scanning the land. They read the tracks like words written in dust, following every turn and pause the girls had made earlier that day. As they climbed the small rise, they too spotted the rocky outcrop in the distance. More importantly, they saw figures near it. Adults, children, and a lone rider on horseback. Without rushing blindly, they paused briefly, assessing the scene from afar. Their hands rested lightly on their equipment, but their faces remained calm. They would move carefully, but they were ready. Back at the rocks, the rancher dismounted slowly from his horse. He moved deliberately, keeping his hands visible, showing that he meant no harm. His boots touched the dusty ground with a soft thud. He stood tall but relaxed, his hat still shading his eyes. He took a few careful steps closer to the girls, stopping well before crossing any invisible line of comfort. He knelt slightly, lowering himself to their level instead of towering over them. "You girls should not be out here alone like this," he said gently. His voice carried concern, not anger. Lena swallowed and glanced at Nala, unsure whether to speak. Nala gave a small nod, giving her permission. "We were getting water and berries," Lena said quietly. Her voice trembled just a little, but she held herself together. The rancher nodded slowly. "That makes sense," he replied. "But this place is too far from your people." Maya spoke up then, her voice faster than she intended. "We did not mean to stay. They told us to come here." She pointed toward the strangers, her hand shaking slightly. The rancher turned his gaze toward them again. He did not glare, but his expression hardened just enough to show that he took the situation seriously. One of the strangers shifted his weight, clearly aware that the balance of the moment had changed. The presence of the rancher, calm but firm, had altered the quiet control they once held. The wind swept across the rocky outcrop, carrying dust across the ground and making the girls' hair flutter slightly. The sun beat down relentlessly, but a different kind of energy now filled the space, one of possibility rather than waiting. Kira watched the rancher closely. She noticed how he kept his distance, how he spoke gently, how his horse stood patiently behind him. In her quiet mind, she began to trust him more with each passing second. Sari slowly loosened her grip on Lena's sleeve. Her small face looked up at the rancher with curious eyes instead of fear. Nala remained standing, strong and composed. She felt something shift inside her, a sense that this moment could change everything. The rancher straightened slightly and turned toward the strangers again. "I think these girls need to go back to their people," he said in a steady voice. He did not threaten. He did not raise his tone. But his words carried weight, like a man who knew how to stand his ground. The strangers exchanged glances among themselves. The stillness of the moment stretched long and tense, as if the land itself were waiting to see what would happen next. In the distance, the two Apache trackers moved closer now, slipping down from the small rise and advancing across the open ground. They were still too far to be clearly recognized, but their presence was undeniable. Two figures moving with clear purpose toward the rocky outcrop. The rancher's horse lifted its head slightly, ears pricked forward, as if sensing them too. At the rocky outcrop, everything balanced on a single silent moment. The heat of the sun, the weight of the stranger's presence, the hope in the girls' hearts, and the steady resolve of the rancher standing between them. Nala took a slow breath. Lena squeezed Sari's hand. Maya stood a little taller. Kira watched, alert and ready, and somewhere across the wide land help was moving closer, step by careful step, toward the 5 girls and the man who had chosen to stop when others might have simply ridden past. The wind whispered through the rocks, carrying with it the promise that this day, which had begun so peacefully, was about to turn in a new and unexpected direction. The sun burned bright above the rocky outcrop, and the heat made the air feel thick and heavy. Dust hung lightly in the breeze, drifting across the ground like a thin gray mist. The land was silent except for the low whistle of the wind moving through cracks in the rocks and the soft breathing of the people gathered there. The 5 girls stood close together now, no longer sitting. Their baskets rested beside them, forgotten for the moment. Their water bags lay at their feet, half full, the leather warm from the sun. Their faces showed a mix of fear, hope, and nervous expectation.
Nala remained at the front of the group, her posture steady and proud. She had not lowered her head or shown weakness. Even though her heart was beating fast inside her chest, she knew her younger cousins were watching her, and she did not want them to see her doubt. Lena kept one arm gently around Ceri's shoulders, holding her close. Ceri's small fingers clutched the edge of Lena's sleeve, but her eyes were no longer filled with pure fear. Instead, they moved between the strangers, the rocks, and the rancher with curious uncertainty. Maya stood slightly behind Nala, her earlier restlessness now replaced by quiet determination. She pressed her lips together, trying to stay calm. Kira stood beside her, eyes sharp and alert, noticing every movement around them. The rancher stood a few steps in front of the girls, facing the strangers. His boots were planted firmly on the dusty ground, but his stance was not aggressive. His shoulders were relaxed, his hands visible, and his voice calm. He spoke again, slowly and clearly, as if choosing each word with care. "These girls do not belong here," he said. "They need to go home." Their faces were serious, but there was no anger there, only uncertainty. They seemed caught between their own plans and the reality of the moment. One of them stepped forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. He spoke in a low voice to the others, words that sounded firm but not harsh. The girls could not understand the language, but they could sense that something important was being decided. The rancher did not interrupt. "Ah!" He waited patiently, giving them space to speak among themselves. His horse stood quietly behind him, shifting its weight now and then, but remaining calm. As the strangers talked, a new sound drifted across the land, faint at first, then growing clearer. It was the steady rhythm of footsteps moving across dry ground. Tira noticed it first, her head turned slightly, her eyes narrowing as she looked toward the distant horizon. She saw two figures approaching from across the plains, moving with purpose but without rushing. Nala followed her gaze and felt her chest tighten with relief. She recognized the familiar way the men moved, steady and sure, as they crossed the open land. Even from far away, she could tell they were Apache trackers. Lena saw them too and let out a small, quiet breath she had been holding for what felt like hours. Maya's eyes widened, and a spark of hope lit her face. Ceri pointed excitedly, tugging at Lena's sleeve. "Look!" she whispered. The rancher turned as well, following their gazes. When he saw the two men approaching, he nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. The strangers also noticed the trackers now. Their quiet discussion stopped. They stood straighter, watching the figures draw closer across the land. The wind picked up slightly, lifting dust in small swirls around their feet. The sunlight reflected off the rocky surface, making the stones shimmer faintly. The two Apache men moved steadily toward the outcrop. They did not run, but their pace was purposeful. Their faces were calm, yet focused, like men who understood both patience and urgency. As they came closer, their features became clearer. Their expressions softened when they saw the five girls standing together, unharmed and alive. But their eyes hardened when they looked at the strangers. Still, they did not shout or rush forward. Instead, they stopped at a respectful distance, placing themselves in a position where they could see everyone clearly. One of the trackers spoke in a calm, firm voice, addressing the strangers first, then the rancher. Though the language was different, his tone carried authority and composure. The rancher straightened slightly and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. He did not speak over them, allowing the men to take the lead in this moment. The strangers shifted uneasily. They were now clearly outnumbered, and the presence of the Apache trackers changed the balance completely. Their earlier control over the situation had faded. After a brief exchange, one of the strangers raised his hand slightly, palms open, showing that he did not intend to fight. He spoke again to the others, and slowly they began to step back, creating more space between themselves and the girls. Nala felt her shoulders relax just a little. She could sense that the danger was loosening its grip. The rancher turned toward the girls and knelt again so he was closer to their level. "It is time to go," he said gently. Lena nodded immediately, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you."
Maya swallowed hard, then spoke with more confidence.
"We want to go home." Nala placed a hand on Ceri's back, guiding her forward slightly. The little girl took a cautious step, then another, trusting the moment.
One of the Apache trackers moved closer now, his face warm but serious. He spoke softly to the girls, his voice full of relief and care.
Though the words were not meant for the rancher, their meaning was clear. They were safe now. The rancher stepped aside slightly, giving the girls space to move toward their people.
But he did not leave yet. He stayed nearby, watching carefully to make sure nothing changed at the last moment. The strangers began to slowly withdraw, walking back toward the open plains rather than deeper into the rocks. They did not look back, but their earlier confidence was gone, replaced by quiet retreat. The trackers moved closer to the girls, placing themselves protectively around them without crowding them. One of them knelt beside Sari and offered her a small, reassuring smile.
"Come!"
he said gently, guiding her away from the rocky ground and towards safer, open land. Nala took the lead, walking with steady steps. Lena followed, keeping her arm around Sari. Maya and Kira stayed close beside them, glancing back only once before focusing on the path ahead. The rancher walked alongside them for a short distance, his horse following calmly behind. He did not speak much, but his presence felt steady and reliable, like a solid fence in a storm.
As they moved farther from the rocky outcrop, the air seemed lighter, easier to breathe. The harsh shadows of the rocks gave way to open sky and rolling land.
The sun still shone bright, but now its warmth felt comforting instead of oppressive. The wind carried fresh scents of grass and distant water, washing away the heaviness of the past hours.
After a while, the rancher stopped. He tipped his hat toward the Apache men and the girls.
"You will be safe from here," he said simply. Nala turned and looked at him. Her dark eyes were full of gratitude. "You helped us," she said quietly. The rancher gave a small, humble smile. Anyone should have done the same.
Lena stepped forward slightly and bowed her head in respect. Maya did the same, and even little Sari offered a shy wave. The Apache trackers spoke briefly with the rancher, their tone respectful. Though they came from different worlds, in that moment they shared a common understanding, the value of protecting young lives. Then the rancher turned and mounted his horse with practiced ease.
He adjusted his hat, took the reins, and gave one final nod toward the group. As he rode slowly back across the plains, the girls watched him go. His figure grew smaller against the wide sky, eventually blending into the shimmering horizon. The trackers led the girls onward toward their camp. Their pace was steady, not rushed, but there was a clear sense of urgency beneath their calm. Along the way, Lena spoke softly to Sari, pointing out familiar landmarks, a lone tall tree, a bend in the land, a distant hill she recognized. With each step, Sari's fear faded a little more. Maya began to talk again, her voice still soft but filled with life. She described the creek, the berries, and how they had tried to stay brave. Kira listened quietly, occasionally adding small details she had noticed. Nala walked beside one of the trackers, answering his gentle questions about what had happened. She spoke clearly and honestly, without exaggeration, showing maturity beyond her years.
As they moved farther from the rocky place, the tension that had gripped them slowly loosened. Their shoulders relaxed, their steps grew lighter, and their faces brightened with relief. In the distance, the Apache camp came into view. Thin lines of smoke still rose from cooking fires, curling gently into the sky.
Tents stood where they always had, familiar and welcoming. Even from far away, they could see movement. People standing, looking toward the horizon, waiting.
When the girls and trackers drew closer, a ripple of emotion passed through the camp. Mothers stepped forward quickly, hands rising to their mouths in relief. Elders straightened, their serious faces softening. Nala's grandmother was among the first to see them.
She rose slowly from her place by the fire, her eyes shining as she recognized the familiar figures approaching. But even as the girls walked toward home, the memory of the rocky outcrop stayed with them. The fear, the waiting, the stranger who had chosen to help, and the moment when everything changed. Behind them, the wide land stretched endlessly under the sun, quiet once more. The rocky outcrop stood still and silent, as if nothing had ever happened there. Yet for the 5 girls, this day would never be forgotten.
It had tested their courage, their bond and their trust in both their people and unexpected kindness.
And as they drew closer to the warm embrace of their community, they carried with them not just baskets of berries and water, but a deeper understanding of the world beyond their camp. A world that could be uncertain, but also full of compassion in the most unexpected places.
Their journey home was not yet finished, but the hardest part was behind them. The sun slowly began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and orange as the 5 girls walked toward safety, surrounded by those who loved them.
The afternoon sun had begun to sink lower in the sky, turning its bright white light into warm shades of gold and orange. Long shadows stretched across the ground, making every rock, tree, and tent look softer and gentler than before. A light breeze moved through the land, carrying the smell of smoke from cooking fires, fresh grass, and distant water. As the 5 girls and the 2 Apache trackers approached the camp, the quiet waiting suddenly turned into movement. People who had been sitting or standing still now stepped forward, their faces lighting up with relief. Nala's grandmother was among the first to move. She walked quickly but carefully, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes were wide, shining with emotion as she recognized her granddaughter leading the group.
Mothers, aunts, and older sisters rushed toward the girls, calling out their names softly, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might make them disappear. Children stopped playing and ran toward the group, curious and excited.
When the girls finally reached the edge of the camp, they were surrounded in an instant. Lena's mother pulled her into a tight embrace, pressing her face into her daughter's hair and breathing deeply, as if needing to feel her there to believe she was truly safe.
Lena wrapped her arms around her mother just as tightly, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. Sari was lifted off the ground by her aunt, who held her close, rocking her gently.
The little girl buried her face in her aunt's shoulder, finally letting out the fear she had been holding inside for so long. Maya's father placed his hands on her shoulders, looking her over carefully from head to toe. His voice trembled slightly when he spoke, but his eyes were filled with pride and love. Maya smiled through her tears, trying to stand tall despite the rush of emotions. Kira stood quietly for a moment, letting the warmth of the camp wash over her. Then her older brother stepped forward and wrapped her in a gentle hug. She did not cry, but her face softened in a way few people ever saw. Nala's grandmother reached her last. She did not rush or speak at first. Instead, she placed both hands on Nala's face, looking deeply into her eyes. "You are home," she said simply. Nala nodded, swallowing hard. In that moment, all her strength, all her calm, all her bravery melted into something softer. She leaned forward and hugged her grandmother, holding her close. The 2 Apache trackers stood slightly apart, watching the reunions with quiet satisfaction. Their job was done, and seeing the girls safe was enough reward. After the first wave of emotion passed, the elders gathered near the center of the camp. The girls were seated together, offered water, warm soup, and soft blankets. Their hands trembled slightly as they drank, the long day finally catching up with them. One of the trackers spoke calmly to the elders, explaining what they had found and how the rancher had helped. His voice was steady, respectful, and clear. As the story spread through the camp, people listened carefully. Some faces showed anger at what had happened. Others showed worry, but most showed deep gratitude. Nala, Lena, Maya, Kira, and Sari sat close together as they listened. They did not speak much at first, still processing everything they had been through. After a while, Nala cleared her throat and began to speak. She described the walk to the creek, the strangers, the rocky place, and the moment when the rancher arrived. She spoke slowly, carefully, without exaggeration or drama. When she mentioned the rancher's calm voice and kind actions, several elders nodded in approval. Lena added her own memories, how scared she had felt, how she had tried to comfort Sari, and how relief had filled her when she saw the trackers and the rancher together. Maya spoke next, her voice stronger now. She talked about how they had stayed together, how they had trusted Nala, and how they had never truly given up hope. Kira, when asked, described small details, the tracks, the wind, the way the stranger stood, the way the rancher moved. Her careful observations helped the elders understand the full picture. Sari said very little, but she held Lena's hand tightly, feeling safe once more among her people.
As evening settled in, the sky turned a deep purple and pink. Stars began to appear one by one like tiny lights scattered across a dark blanket.
The camp slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Fires crackled softly, and the smell of cooking filled the air.
People spoke in low, comforting voices rather than excited or fearful ones. But this day would not be forgotten. Later that night, after most of the camp had eaten and children had been put to sleep, the elders gathered around a central fire. The flames danced in the darkness, casting warm light on their faces. They spoke about the land, about trust, about danger, and about kindness. They reminded everyone that while the world beyond the camp could be unpredictable, it could also hold unexpected allies. Nala's grandmother spoke last.
She looked at the 5 girls sitting together near the fire, wrapped in blankets, their faces tired but peaceful.
"You have learned much today,"
she said softly.
"You learned to stay together. You learned to be brave without being foolish. And you learned that kindness can come from places you do not expect."
The girls listened quietly, feeling the weight and wisdom of her words. Meanwhile, far across the plains, the rancher had returned to his own land. The sun had set behind him as he rode, painting the sky in fiery colors. His horse carried him steadily back toward his ranch, where fences, cattle, and familiar fields awaited. When he finally reached his home, the stars were bright above, and the night was calm. He dismounted, fed his horse, and settled inside his small house. He did not boast about what he had done. To him, it had simply been the right thing. Back at the Apache camp, the night grew quiet. The 5 girls lay close together inside a tent, listening to the gentle sounds of the fire outside and the soft breathing of those around them. Lena stroked Sari's hair until the little girl fell asleep. Maya stared up at the dark roof of the tent, replaying the day in her mind, but no longer with fear. Kira lay still, thoughtful and reflective. Nala rested on her side, her eyes half closed. She felt tired but also stronger than before. She had faced something difficult and come through it. Before sleep took her, she whispered softly to herself, remembering the rancher's calm voice and steady presence.
Outside, the wind moved gently across the land, rustling grass and carrying the distant sounds of night creatures.
The creek flowed quietly in the distance, its water glimmering under the moonlight. The next morning, the camp would wake to a new day.
The sun would rise again, bright and warm, just as it always had. Life would continue, gathering, working, learning, and growing. But for the 5 Apache girls, something inside them had changed. They were no longer just children who walked to the creek together. They were young girls who had faced uncertainty, stayed united, and been saved by both their own courage and the compassion of a stranger.
In the days that followed, the story of their experience would be told quietly around fires, passed from elder to child, reminding everyone of 2 important truths: that danger could appear when least expected, and that kindness could appear just as suddenly.
As the stars faded and the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the Apache camp rested peacefully. The 5 girls slept safely among their people, wrapped in warmth, love, and protection. And somewhere out across the wide land, the rancher continued his life, unaware that his single choice to stop and help would live on in the hearts of 5 young girls and an entire community. The world was still vast, still uncertain, still full of challenges. But it was also full of hope.